We are kind of getting ready for what is my least favorite time of the year. If you don't know already, the NBA Finals are going on right now, and from the looks of it, it doesn't look like it's going to last all that much longer. And then there's just nothing until football. I looked it up today, and we are 90 days away from the NFL kickoff weekend. That's a long time to wait for football, and I sometimes wonder if football misses me as much as Didn't I say this last week? And didn't we sing the same songs last Sunday? And didn't I wear this last week? Man, don't you just hate reruns? It's not as bad these days as it used to be. I mean, now we've got various streaming services and all kinds of different things, so we can be a lot more selective about what it is that we choose to watch, or how much of it we watch, or how long we watch it for. And if you're anything like me, that last one is usually a lot longer than it should be. But reruns were such a frustrating thing when you were growing up, wasn't it? I mean, you spent all week waiting for your favorite program to finally come on. You were so excited to get the very next chapter, or to find out what the fallout of what happened last week was going to be this week. And then it started, and your heart sank a little bit because you'd already seen this one. And you'd have to wait a whole other week to find out what was next. It was especially frustrating after the season finale, because you'd spend all summer waiting to find out who shot JR, or what was going to happen now that Picard had been assimilated by the Borg, or what's going to happen now that Jim and Pam have finally kissed. And instead you get suffered for 3 months of dealing with episodes probably that you'd seen 100 times already. And it's not like the concept of a rerun was developed out of something great. I don't know how aware of this you are, but the concept of a rerun was not meant from TV executives so that the fans of their shows could get caught up on episodes that they'd missed, or be able to fill in the gaps on some things that may have happened while they were out. That was just kind of a happy little side accident of this whole thing. The reason reruns exist is because it's a whole lot cheaper to play an old episode than it is to make a new episode. If you make a new episode, you got to pay writers and directors and actors and stunt coordinators and all the other ins and outs that go along with a TV episode, and some of those contracts are real expensive per episode. But a rerun, you just got to pay royalties, and that is a fraction of what it is. I listened to a podcast called The Office Ladies, and it's Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey from The Office reviewing episodes, and they talked about royalty checks at one point in time, and they said, yeah, I got a royalty check for one episode that was like 87 cents for an episode that they probably made like $300,000 on for that one film. So it's a lot cheaper to show a rerun than to make a new episode. The concept of reruns exists solely because of one thing and one thing only: corporate greed. What a wonderful thought, right? I don't know about how you guys felt whenever you'd see a rerun, whenever you were watching TV, but for me, it seemed like they always picked just the worst episodes to show us, too. Like, out of all the reruns you're going to show us, you're going to pick the absolute worst possible ones. Of course, that could be that my memory is tainted, because as a kid, I was so frustrated having to watch a rerun and not being able to find out how the Green Ranger was going to save the day when he lost his powers 3 months ago. Nobody else? That scarred me, man. We don't need to get into it. But even if it's a great episode, it's never as exciting as watching something that's new, or seeing something that's different, or getting onto something that could be amazing. But it could possibly be worse. I recently heard a story about a small little local channel, a local affiliate, and once the day's programming from the main channel, or whatever you call it, was over, they would always show just old television shows. It's a good way to kind of pad their runtime and make things easy. And there was a guy who worked there whose whole job was to switch out tapes. They had 2 VCRs. Kids, if you don't know what a VCR is, ask your parents later today. You'll make them feel real old. It's awesome. They had 2 VCRs with a little switch in between them, that once one tape had finished, his whole job was to hit the switch for the next tape, when it finished rewinding, to take the tape out of it that had just finished and swap it out for something new. That's his job. Sign me up for that one, please. But apparently, one evening, the young man fell asleep. And he found let me phrase it, the station found something really interesting, and that's if you let the tape rewind all the way, it just automatically starts playing it again. And so for about a 4-hour stretch, the viewers of that particular station were subjected to the same episode of My Three Sons over and over and over again. I don't care how good a show My Three Sons is, if you're watching the same episode for 4 hours, kind of loses some of the magic. I never really watched My Three Sons. I think I saw like half an episode once, so I threw that one. Maybe you guys might like that because it's My Three Sons. Should have gone with MASH. Okay, cool. Anyway, but it's always kind of interesting to watch characters that you care about wrestle with some big important decision or make some kind of giant mistake or fall into some kind of trouble. It's really fun to watch that once. That's fine, that's entertaining, that's even enjoyable. But watching the same people or the same group fall into the same trap, get into the same trouble, make the same jokes time after time after time, it just kind of wears thin, doesn't it? In fact, it could be downright maddening at a certain point. You want to kind of shake them as much as you can, wondering, how can you keep doing this? How can you keep making the same mistakes? How could you keep doing the same stupid things? Why can't you make newer mistakes, at least? The first time you understand, you can even relate to their behavior, but the 100th time you've seen it, all you can do is wonder why you're watching the same rerun again. And on some level, it kind of feels that way with our text today. We're going to land in 1 Samuel chapter 7, so go ahead and turn there. But stick your thumb there, like we've got a lot of narrative to cover between where we left off last week and where we're at this week. And I kind of want to give you an idea of how we got here to this particular part of the story of Samuel in 1 Samuel 7. Previously, in the life of Samuel, I worked on that voice all week. Did that work? Great. All right. Somebody said perfect. Thank you. In the life of Samuel, we talked about a conversation that Samuel had that should have been one of the greatest moments of his life until God started talking to him. We talked about this notion where Samuel, at this age of 12 years old, received a word from God himself, and it should have been one so cool, but then God started. And when God starts off a whole conversation by saying, I'm about to do something in Israel that everyone who hears about it will shudder, you probably know this isn't going to be great news. And there has to be some part of Samuel that when he heard that, he knew that this wasn't going to be awesome for him. And God ended up telling Samuel in the midst of that conversation that Eli, the priest, the guy who had been the most consistent father figure in Samuel's life, was about to face judgment. Was about to undergo something that was going to last not just with him, but with his entire family. Samuel could not have considered that to be good news. But Eli wasn't going to be the only one who was going to feel the judgment of God. Again, God said all of Israel was going to face this. This was something that was going to affect everybody who was about to feel this particular judgment of God, because sometime later the Israelites found themselves at war. And they're at war with, well, who else? The Philistines. Right? If you know anything about the Old Testament and Israel, the Philistines are always the bad guy. At least 99% of the time, the Philistines are the bad guy. It's kind of like, turning on an episode of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. You could probably guess that Shredder's going to be the bad guy this week. I'm just going to keep throwing old TV show references the rest of the sermon. If you guys get it, cool. But it's going to happen. Anyway, but they keep going into these battles with these guys. The Philistines and the Israelites have been in a never-ending conflict, seemingly since the nation of Israel really began. And this particular time, as they're going into this battle, things are just not going well for Israel. It says at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 2, it says, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who struck down 4,000 men on the battlefield. That's a bad day. If you're at war with somebody, and these nations are not like millions of people, and you lose 4,000 men in a single battle, that's not good. And when the Israelites kind of got back together and they huddled, they asked themselves a question. They asked, why is the Lord defeating us? What an interesting question. They didn't ask, how are the Philistines beating us? They didn't ask, what's wrong with our strategy? They asked, why is God defeating us? Kind of gives you a really unique look as to where their hearts were as an entire nation at this particular time, but more on that later. The Israelites get an idea. They think, we know how to turn this battle around. We're going to draw on our own history, in fact. Somebody gets it in their brain, you know what would be a really good idea? What if we brought the Ark of the Covenant with us to battle tomorrow? If you're unfamiliar, the Ark of the Covenant, it symbolized the presence of God amongst his people. It was, still is, I assume. We haven't found it yet. I think it's in a warehouse in New Jersey, according to Indiana Jones. But inside the Ark of the Covenant was left things like the Ten Commandments that Moses brought down, Moses' staff, the robe of Aaron, and different elements that all pointed to the presence of God amongst his people throughout history. And so they thought, if we bring this thing with us, then maybe it'll be like it was for Joshua, and we'll be able to beat them pretty easily. Because when Joshua brought the Ark with him, it was no contest. It was over before it began. And so they get the idea, let's bring the Ark of the Covenant with us, and something will happen. What did they do wrong? See, we haven't even gotten to the battle, and we've already got something that they've done wrong. Have you picked up on it yet? I think they skipped a step or two. See, first off, the mistake that the Israelites are making here is that they are equating the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the presence of God, for actually being the presence of God. There's a difference between a symbol and the real thing, right? We don't look at things that are symbols of things and assume that they're the real thing. If I wear a Batman t-shirt tomorrow, nobody's thinking I'm Batman, right? That'd be so cool. But that doesn't happen. We see the symbol, but it's not the actual thing. I don't morph into Michael Keaton. But they were equating this particular thing, this representative of God's presence, and they were seeing this as being God himself. That's mistake number one. Mistake number two, at no point in any of this, at no point in their preparation for this war, at no point in their preparation even for this battle that's about to take place the next day, did any of them think, hey, should we talk to God first? Nobody prayed asking God to be in their midst. Nobody asked God to go in the battle ahead of them. Nobody asked God to be with them while they were in the battle. They were not inviting God into the midst of this. And this gives us an idea of where their opinion of God is as a nation at this particular time. They thought if we just bring the ark, God will be there. They were taking God for granted. They were taking him, the Almighty God, the one who created it all, the one who sustains it all, the one who chose them all the way back at Abraham, saying, I will be your God if you will be my people. And they had taken that relationship for granted. And God was about to show them that you probably shouldn't do that. Because the next day, as the battle commences, things go disastrously. In fact, I don't think things could have gone any worse. And 1 Samuel 4, 10 and 11 shows us exactly how things went. We read, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and each man fled to his tent. The slaughter was severe. 30,000 of the Israelite foot soldiers fell. You lost 4,000 yesterday, you lost 30,000 today. That's a bad day. But it gets worse. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Understand, the loss of life in the midst of this battle is bad enough. The idea that 30,000 men who left home to go into battle are not coming home is heartbreaking. It's a disaster. But for the nation of Israel, the idea that the ark of God would be taken away from them may have actually been worse. Again, right or wrong, they viewed the Ark of the Covenant as the symbol of God's presence amongst them. And so the idea that the symbol of God's presence would leave, for them it's the same idea that God left. That God has abandoned them in the midst of all of this. In fact, as a messenger comes to tell Eli what's going on in chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, see if you see what I see. The messenger answered him, Israel has fled from the Philistines. There was a great slaughter among the people. Your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are both dead, and the ark of God has been captured. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off the chair by the city gate, and since he was old and heavy, his neck broke and he died. Eli had judged Israel for 40 years. It wasn't the news of the death of his sons that sent Eli off that chair. You would think as a father that may be the thing that would kind of cause him to recoil the way that he did, to the point that it broke his neck. But it wasn't until the messenger said that the ark of God had been taken that Eli reacted in such a violent, aggressive backlash that it led to his own death. Because the presence of God was no longer around his people. God had left them. And that's what literally knocked Eli off of his chair and ushered him into his own death. You would hope that maybe this moment right here would be the wake-up call that the nation of Israel needed. That this would be the moment where they think, you know what? Clearly we've messed up. Because if even the Ark of the Covenant of God is not enough to help us win this battle, then that must mean that we must not be right with God. You would hope that this is the moment where the entire nation recognizes, you know what, we've strayed in our faith. We've strayed away from God, and we need to kind of get back to that. We need to restore that relationship with God, and then maybe we can correct everything else that falls there. Maybe we need to hit the heart of this first. You would hope that this moment right here is enough. But look what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 2. It says, time went by until 20 years had passed since the ark had been taken to Kiriath-Jearim. Then the whole house of Israel longed for the Lord. 20 years. At no point in time in 20 years did anybody in the nation of Israel think, you know what, maybe we messed up. It took 2 whole decades for them to realize just how far they had fallen away from God, to recognize that our relationship with God is not where it ought to be, and that maybe we ought to do something about that. 20 years before they approached Samuel, now a full-grown man of God, and asked him, hey, what do we got to do? It didn't happen when the ark of God was taken away. It didn't happen when over a 2-day span, 34,000 men lost their lives. It took 20 more years for them to realize we'd made a mistake. Finally, when they come to Samuel, Samuel gives them even more of a clue as to how far Israel had strayed from God in verse 3. It says, Samuel told him, if you're returning to the Lord with all your heart, get rid of the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths that are among you. Set your hearts on the Lord and worship only him. Then he will rescue you from the Philistines. Get rid of your false gods. I don't know what you remember about the 10 Commandments. It's been a little while since we talked about them, but number 1, no other gods, right? So Samuel tells them to get rid of these false idols that they have in their midst. And I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that a lot of those are probably a little older than 20 years. That at some point in time, the nation of Israel strayed so far from God that they began to worship other gods. And nobody saw a problem with it in 20 years. Until Samuel says, get rid of them. Set your heart back with where God wants you to be. Get back to where you're supposed to be. Get rid of these distractions. Get rid of this thing that's causing you to stumble. And so once they do that and they get rid of all this stuff, they come back to Samuel and say, hey, we got rid of them all. And in verse 5, Samuel tells them, gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord on your behalf. This is kind of a cool moment, isn't it? Because he's telling them to gather all of Israel. An entire nation of people gathering together in one spot for the sole purpose of restoring their connection with God. How cool is that, right? Could you picture something like that happening? In our context, let's go smaller even. If a whole state did that, that's incredible. You know what? No, a whole city did that. That'd be amazing. But all Israel does it. Entire nation gathering together in one spot so that the head priest, the leader of this entire nation, the new judge after Eli had passed, can help them restore themselves to God. It's incredible. Unless you're a Philistine, in which case you hear word that the entire nation is gathering in one spot, and you don't see something pretty, you see opportunity. It says in verse 7, when the Philistines heard that all the Israelites had gathered at Mizpah, the rulers marched up towards Israel. When the Israelites heard about it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. I want to point out something here that I find really, really cool. And I could expand about how scary it would be if an entire nation is gathered in one spot and all the bad guys are coming towards you. That's one thing we could talk about. But I really want to... How appropriate is it that the Philistines are here? Right? 20 years ago, when the presence of God is taken away from them, or at least the symbol of the presence of God is taken away from them, the Philistines were there. 20 years later, when they're seeking out the presence of God, when their hearts are content, when they've realized their mistake, when they're ready to turn back, who's there? It's kind of fun how God bookends things like that, right? And really all throughout Scripture we see those sorts of things, and they're kind of cool when you notice them. So be on the lookout for those sorts of things. But the Philistines are here, and they're coming towards them as they're chasing after the presence of God. And in fact, verse 8 has something, again, that I think is interesting. It says, the Israelites said to Samuel, don't stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, so that he will save us from the Philistines. What I find interesting about that is it's the Israelites asking Samuel to stay connected with God, not the other way around. It makes sense if Samuel, as their spiritual advisor, their leader, their pastor, whatever term you want to give him, if he were to say, hey guys, I know the Philistines are coming, don't get distracted, we're doing something important here. If I said something like that, that makes sense, right? But it's not Samuel who's saying, hey, stay focused on God, it's the Israelites. They've recognized after 20 years that they've messed up so bad that they need the presence of God. That is the only thing that is going to get them out of this whole scenario. They've realized that they can't handle this on their own. And so now they're chasing after the one thing that they know is actually going to bring deliverance to them. It's amazing. And sure enough, God shows up. He shows up in a big, big way. We see in verses 10 and 11, Samuel was offering the burnt offering as the Philistines approached to fight against Israel. The Lord thundered loudly against the Philistines that day and threw them into such confusion they were defeated by Israel. And the men of Israel charged out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, striking them down all the way to a place below Beth-Kar. The nation of Israel is finally ready to turn back to God. They're finally ready to give their hearts back to him, and God shows up in a big way. Can you imagine the worship that took place after that? 20 years ago, when they didn't pursue after God, they got their rear ends handed to them. 20 years later, when they're actively seeking to pursue after God, God demonstrates that he's got their back. That because they were willing to get rid of these false idols, because they were willing to recognize that they had taken God for granted, because they were willing to see that they messed up, God is immediately ready to restore that relationship and protect them as if it had never happened beforehand. This is such a great picture. The Israelites strayed away from God, taking him for granted. They see the results of that mistake. Eventually they return to him. They seek him out, and he proved that he was never far to begin with. What an amazing moment! What a great story! Except, we've seen this before. We've seen this exact story played out. And not just once, over and over and over and over and over again. See, because before we get to 1 Samuel, there's two books that come before it. One's Ruth, and to be honest with you, I kind of wonder why Ruth is there. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for it to be right there. It's sort of this random story about a guy and a girl who fall in love that just kind of shows up in the middle of nowhere. But just before that one is the book of Judges. And I don't know if you've ever read the book of Judges. Maybe you've heard me say that I consider the book of Judges to be the most depressing book of the Bible. Understand, I'm including a book called Lamentations, and to lament means literally to mourn. It is a book that is nothing but the mourning of the prophet Jeremiah. I find that book more annoying to read than anything else. Like, good Lord, man. But the book of Judges, the reason why I consider this to be the most depressing book in all of Scripture is because it is the same story over and over again. The nation of Israel strays away from God. God allows them to face the consequences of that choice. They eventually decide after a period of time, oftentimes 20 years, that we messed up. They turn their hearts back to God. God demonstrates his faithfulness to them and restores that relationship. Wash, rinse, repeat. There's two verses in the book of Judges that kind of repeat themselves over and over again. First one is simply that then another generation grew up that did not know the Lord. That's exciting. The next one is kind of varies between these two different things. Everyone did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, or everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. Those kinds of things are interchangeable, aren't they? Because like we said last week, when human beings are left to their own devices, we will always make bad choices. Every single time. If you don't know that to be true in your own life, you probably need to reevaluate some of those choices that you've made. And the book of Judges does this over and over again. And so by the time we get to 1 Samuel chapter 7 and we are back in the same spot again, this is a bad rerun. This is a rerun of the worst episode of your favorite television show. I don't care what TV show you love, that you've watched over and over again. If it goes on longer than a few years, there's a bad episode or two in there. Imagine being stuck watching your least favorite episode of your favorite show over and over again, because that's what the nation of Israel is doing time after time after time here. They are making the same mistake over and over again to the point that you got to sit there and you got to wonder, why do you keep doing these same things over and over again? But if I'm honest, I oftentimes have to ask myself the same question. Why do I keep making the same mistakes over and over again? I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you've probably had to ask yourself that question beforehand too. See, I don't think that most of us in this room, that we're constantly making new mistakes or constantly trying out new sins. I sincerely doubt that you woke up today and said, well, I tried lying yesterday. I think today I might steal something. Or maybe I'll try adultery. Or I don't know, maybe I'll try murder. Nobody's doing that. In fact, if you're anything like me, and again, I'm going to assume that probably you are, at least on some level, the same mistakes that you're making today, you made yesterday. And probably the day before that. And the year before that. And the decade before that. We are stuck seemingly in this vicious cycle that we know we should not be in. of making the same mistake, of taking God for granted, of dealing with the consequences of that and realizing, yeah, you know what, I need to make a change. Wash, rinse, repeat until they put us in the ground. See, the problem is that we know that we can do something different. We know that we can make a change. But all of us, we still seem to be stuck in this terrible rerun. In fact, the Apostle Paul, I think, understood this particular thing when he wrote in Romans 7:15, "For I do not understand what I'm doing, because I do not practice what I want to do, but I do what I hate." Every single human being that has ever walked on God's green earth, with the exception of Jesus himself, has made mistakes, and oftentimes the same mistake over and over again. We've committed the same sin over and over and over again. We've fallen prey to the same temptation, and we know we can do better. We know that we should be able to do better because we know what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10:13, saying that no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. God is faithful. He will He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation, He will also provide the way out so that you might be able to bear it. We know this. I'm going to go ahead and assume that the Israelites probably knew it, but at no point in time in Judges or here in the first part of 1 Samuel, or later on, because of course, why not later on too, did anybody in all of Israel happen to say, "Hey guys, I'm starting to see something here. I think we're making the same mistakes our parents made. Or I think we're making the same mistakes the generations before us made. Maybe we shouldn't." Oftentimes we do the same thing for ourselves. We kind of see that I'm making the same mistake again. That I'm allowing myself to go down this path that I know is not good for me. That I know is only going to end in heartache. That I know is only going to end up in hurt. At some point, ladies and gentlemen, we got to look for the way out. Paul told us God will always provide a way out. We got to start looking for that exit. We got to start figuring out what it is that's leading us down this path to begin with. What things are happening around us that are getting us to this point. Because if you're anything like me, it's probably the same stuff, probably the same scenarios. You find yourself in the same situation again. You find yourself feeling that temptation that you have felt 1,000 times beforehand. And you're not looking for the way out. Maybe for you it means you got to actually physically get out of there. Joseph, when he was faced with Potiphar's wife, facing that kind of temptation, he turned tail and ran. And there was nothing in the world wrong with that. Sometimes physically, we got to remove ourselves from that situation. Sometimes that may mean going to bed a little earlier than you normally do. Sometimes that may mean not hanging out with that group anymore. Sometimes that may mean turning your phone off so that that person can't call you. You can't text that individual. You can't go to that site. We have to start looking for the exit. If we ever want to get out of this stupid, vicious cycle and see the same rerun in our life over and over again, we got to be willing to say we're done. But there's one other thing in this pattern. There's one other thing in this consistent rerun in the nation of Israel that I think we also ought to look at. I think it's easy for us to focus on Israelites making the same mistakes over and over again. Probably because we recognize that in ourselves. Because we recognize that we're making those same mistakes, and so we relate to the nation of Israel here. But have you noticed that no matter how many times the nation of Israel turns their back on Him, no matter how many times they make the same dumb choices, no matter how many times they fail, once they turn themselves back to God, once they make that realization and they want to get their hearts right with Him, once they want to restore the relationship with God that they have allowed to deteriorate, God is right there. He's ready to go. The only thing He was waiting for was for them to turn back. It's so easy when we read through Scripture to come to the assumption that God in the Old Testament and God in the New Testament must be two different guys, because the God in the Old Testament is constantly doling out judgment. The God in the New Testament is all about grace. But if there's anything that this cycle of the Israelites' sin, failure, falling away, and coming back together, if there's one thing that it points out to us, it's that God's grace is there. God's grace has always been there. It is ever present. Old Testament, New Testament, doesn't matter, because God's love for the Israelite was so much so that when they finally recognized that they had made that mistake, when they finally were ready to turn themselves back over to God, no matter how many times they made the same dumb choices, God was right there, ready to welcome them back in, ready to restore that relationship. Because of that, no matter how many times we fail, no matter how many times we turn our back on him, no matter how many times that I make the same dumb choice, we can rest knowing that God's grace is still there for us. I don't care how bad you've messed up. I don't care how many times you've made that same mistake. I don't care how many times that you have fallen away, doing something that you know you shouldn't do, being in a situation that you know is only going to lead to disaster. God still loves you. And he's just waiting. He's just waiting for you to turn and say, you know what? I messed up. And his grace is ever present. It is going to be there, even when it's a rerun. The author of Hebrews marveled at this very thought when he penned Hebrews 4, verse 16. We'll close with it. It says, therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need.